The bar was a grimy little place tucked into the shadowy corners of Chicago, far from the bright lights and bustling streets of the city. It smelled of stale beer, cigarette smoke, and regret. Flickering neon signs outside cast red and blue glows through the smudged windows, illuminating the faces of those who preferred to stay hidden. Jack sat at a corner table in the back, his fingers drumming nervously against the scratched wooden surface. He was a wiry man with tired eyes that darted around the room like he expected someone to jump him at any moment. His coat hung loosely over his bony shoulders, and beneath it, something small and metallic shifted slightly when he moved. Across from Jack sat Rachel Monroe, her sharp features softened only by the dim lighting. She wasn't the kind of person you wanted to cross. Her reputation preceded her, quick-witted, ruthless, and always armed. She had built her life on taking what she wanted without asking for permission. Tonight, she leaned forward slightly, resting her elbows on the table as she studied Jack with a mix of curiosity and disdain. "So," Rachel said, her voice low but firm, "what exactly is this item you're trying to sell me?" Jack hesitated, glancing toward the door before finally pulling out a small metallic cage from under his coat. It was no bigger than a shoebox, its bars gleaming faintly in the dim light. Inside, curled up tightly, was a creature unlike anything most people would ever see. Its fur shimmered faintly, almost like liquid silver, and its large, intelligent eyes blinked slowly as it looked around the room. For a moment, the cub seemed to meet Rachel's gaze, and she felt an odd chill run down her spine. "You stole this," Rachel stated flatly, leaning back in her chair. There was no question in her tone, it was a fact. Jack swallowed hard, his throat dry. "Does it matter how I got it?" he asked, his voice cracking slightly. "What matters is what you're willing to pay." Rachel tilted her head, studying him carefully. "And if I don't like your price?" she countered, raising an eyebrow. Before Jack could respond, the heavy wooden door of the bar swung open with a creak. A tall figure stepped inside, silhouetted against the streetlights outside. He wore a leather jacket and carried himself with an air of quiet confidence that immediately drew attention. When he stepped closer, revealing his face, Jack recognized him instantly. It was Daniel Hayes, a name whispered in certain circles with equal parts fear and respect. Daniel wasn't the kind of man who blended into crowds. He stood out, even when he didn't want to. Daniel walked straight toward their table, ignoring the curious stares from other patrons. He stopped just short of sitting down, his piercing gaze fixed on Rachel. "I'll take the cub," he said simply, his deep voice cutting through the hum of conversation in the room. Rachel frowned, clearly irritated. "Excuse me, this isn't your business." "It is now," Daniel replied, his tone calm but final. Jack shifted uncomfortably in his seat, sensing the tension rising. "Look, maybe we can work something out," he began, but Rachel cut him off with a glare. "No one takes what's mine unless they're ready to pay the price," she snapped, reaching for the knife strapped to her ankle. But Daniel was faster. In one swift motion, he grabbed her wrist, twisting it until she dropped the weapon with a gasp. Before she could recover, he shoved her backward, sending her sprawling onto the floor. Jack tried to bolt, clutching the cage tightly, but Daniel caught him by the collar and slammed him against the wall with enough force to knock the wind out of him. The entire bar fell silent, watching as Daniel retrieved the cage and turned to leave. No one dared stop him. By the time Rachel scrambled to her feet, blood trickling from a cut on her lip, Daniel was already gone, leaving chaos in his wake. Outside, the cold night air hit Daniel like a slap. He adjusted the cage in his arms, feeling the weight of what he had just done settle over him. He didn't know why he had intervened or what he planned to do next. All he knew was that he couldn't let someone like Rachel get her hands on the cub. Whatever it was, it deserved better than to end up in her greedy grasp. As he disappeared into the shadows of the city, the cub stared up at him with those unnervingly human eyes, and for the first time in a long while, Daniel felt a flicker of purpose ignite within him. Daniel Hayes wasn't a man who wasted time thinking about the past. He lived in the present, always moving forward, always looking for the next challenge. But as he walked through the dark streets of Chicago with the metallic cage tucked securely under his arm, he couldn't shake the feeling that something about this cub was different. It wasn't just the shimmering fur or the intelligent eyes. There was something deeper, something almost familiar. He pushed the thought aside, focusing instead on getting out of sight before anyone decided to follow him. By the time Daniel reached his apartment, sweat had begun to bead on his forehead despite the cold night air. His building was nothing special, a brick structure with peeling paint and flickering hallway lights, but it was quiet, and no one asked questions. He climbed the stairs quickly, his boots thudding softly against the worn steps. When he finally unlocked his door and stepped inside, he let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The apartment was small but tidy, filled with books stacked haphazardly on shelves and faded photographs pinned to the walls. A single lamp illuminated the room, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. Daniel set the cage down gently on the kitchen counter, then stood back to study the creature inside. The cub blinked up at him, its large eyes reflecting the dim light. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, neither moving nor making a sound. "Your trouble," Daniel muttered under his breath, running a hand through his hair. "Big trouble." The cub tilted its head as if trying to understand what he had said. Then, to Daniel's surprise, it made a soft chirping noise almost like laughter. He frowned, leaning closer. "What are you supposed to be anyway?" he asked, though he didn't expect an answer. Over the next few hours, Daniel did his best to figure out how to care for the cub. He didn't know much about animals, let alone ones that looked like they belonged in some distant galaxy. After rummaging through his fridge, he found a piece of leftover chicken and tore off a small chunk. Holding it between his fingers, he offered it cautiously to the cub. At first, it sniffed the air, its tiny nose twitching. Then, after a moment's hesitation, it reached out with one delicate paw and took the meat, chewing slowly. "Well, that's a start," Daniel said, watching as the cub finished eating. It licked its lips, then gave another chirp, this one sounding slightly more content. Despite himself, Daniel felt a faint smile tug at the corners of his mouth. "Guess I'm stuck with you for now." As the days passed, Daniel began settling into a routine. Every morning he would wake up early, make coffee, and check on the cub before heading out to run errands. He bought fresh meat from the market, avoiding places where he might attract unwanted attention. Back at home, he spent hours observing the cub, learning its habits and quirks. It was playful, often batting at objects Daniel left lying around, and seemed to enjoy mimicking his movements. If Daniel stretched his arms, the cub would stretch too. If he yawned, so did the cub. It was strange, almost uncanny, but also oddly comforting. One evening, as Daniel sat on the couch flipping through an old book, the cub crawled clumsily toward him. Its legs were still wobbly, but it managed to climb onto the cushion beside him. It nudged his arm gently, then settled down, curling up against his side. Daniel froze, unsure of what to do. Slowly, he reached out and patted its head, half expecting it to bite him. Instead, it closed its eyes and let out a soft purring sound. "Okay," Daniel whispered, shaking his head. "This is officially weird." But weird or not, he couldn't deny that having the cub around made things feel lighter. Life had been hard for Daniel ever since he left his old job working security for Interstellar traders. He had seen too much, done too much, and carried the weight of it all on his shoulders. The cub, with its innocent curiosity and quiet companionship, reminded him of a part of himself he thought he'd lost forever. Of course, not everything was peaceful. One afternoon, while Daniel was out buying supplies, he returned to find his apartment door slightly ajar. His heart sank as he pushed it open, bracing himself for the worst. Inside, the place was trashed, drawers pulled out, furniture overturned, papers scattered everywhere. And in the middle of it all stood Rachel Monroe, her arms crossed and her expression unreadable. "Impressive setup you've got here," she said dryly, glancing around at the mess. "Very cozy." Daniel clenched his fists, stepping further into the room. "What do you want?" Rachel smirked, gesturing toward the kitchen counter where the cage sat untouched. "You know exactly what I want. Hand over the cub and maybe I'll forget about the little stunt you pulled at the bar." "No deal," Daniel replied, his voice steady despite the anger boiling beneath the surface. Rachel sighed, pulling a knife from her belt. "I was hoping you'd say that." What followed was chaos. Rachel lunged at him, blade flashing in the dim light, but Daniel was ready. He dodged her attack, grabbing a chair and swinging it at her with enough force to send her stumbling backward. The cub squealed from its cage, clearly distressed, as the two of them fought their way across the apartment. Furniture toppled, glass shattered, and blood dripped onto the floor, but neither of them backed down. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Daniel managed to disarm Rachel, pinning her against the wall with one hand around her throat. She struggled, gasping for air, but he held firm. "Get out," he growled, his voice low and dangerous. "And don't come back." Rachel spat at him, her eyes blazing with hatred, but she didn't argue. Once he released her, she staggered toward the door, shooting him one last venomous glare before disappearing into the hallway. When the adrenaline faded, Daniel collapsed onto the floor, his body aching from the fight. The cub pressed itself against the bars of its cage, whining softly. Daniel reached out, patting it reassuringly. "It's okay," he murmured, though he wasn't sure if he was talking to the cub or himself. "We're going to be fine." For now, at least, they were safe. But Daniel knew better than to think it would last. Rachel wouldn't give up easily, and there were others out there who would stop at nothing to get their hands on the cub. Whatever happened next, Daniel vowed to protect it, not because he owed it anything, but because it had become more than just a responsibility. It had become family. Daniel Hayes wasn't used to feeling responsible for anyone or anything. For years, he had lived his life alone, moving from one job to the next without looking back. But now, as he sat on the edge of his battered couch with the cub curled up beside him, he couldn't deny that something had changed. The small creature had wormed its way into his routine, and despite his best efforts to keep his distance, Daniel found himself growing attached. Every morning started the same way. He'd wake up to the soft chirping sounds the cub made, its version of a greeting. It would stretch lazily, its shimmering fur catching the early light streaming through the window before crawling over to nudge his arm. At first, Daniel had ignored it, rolling over and pretending to sleep a little longer. But eventually he gave in, sitting up and scratching behind its ears. The cub seemed to enjoy this immensely, letting out a series of happy squeaks as it leaned into his touch. Breakfast was another ritual they shared. Daniel didn't have much in terms of food, just basic groceries like bread, eggs, and meat. But he always made sure the cub got its share. He experimented with different types of meat, discovering that it preferred chicken and beef over fish. Watching the cub eat became a quiet kind of entertainment for him. Its tiny paws would grasp at the pieces of meat, tearing them apart with surprising strength for such a small creature. When it finished, it would lick its lips and look up at him expectantly, as if asking for more. During the day, while Daniel worked around the apartment or read one of the many books stacked on his shelves, the cub followed him wherever he went. It was clumsy at first, often tripping over its own legs as it tried to keep up. But over time, it grew steadier, learning to navigate the uneven floorboards and narrow spaces between furniture. Sometimes, it would mimic his actions, standing on its hind legs when he stood or tilting its head when he did. Other times, it would entertain itself by batting at loose objects, a pen, a crumpled piece of paper, even the hem of Daniel's jeans. At night, the cub curled up on the couch beside him, its warm body pressed against his side. Daniel wasn't sure why it chose to stay so close, but he didn't mind. There was something comforting about having it there, a living reminder that he wasn't entirely alone anymore. On particularly cold nights, he draped an old blanket over both of them, earning a contented purr from the cub. But not everything was peaceful. Rachel Monroe hadn't shown her face again since their fight, but Daniel knew she wouldn't give up easily. Every creak of the floorboards outside his door, every unfamiliar voice in the hallway, sent his heart racing. He began taking precautions, double-checking the locks on his windows and keeping a baseball bat within arm's reach. He even considered moving to a new location, but the thought of leaving everything behind felt overwhelming. One evening, as Daniel sat at the kitchen table flipping through an old newspaper, he heard a faint scratching sound coming from the other side of the room. Looking up, he saw the cub pawing at the cage bars, clearly restless. "What's wrong with you?" he asked, setting the paper aside and walking over. The cub looked up at him, its large eyes wide and alert. Then, without warning, it let out a sharp chirp and pointed one tiny paw toward the window. Daniel frowned, glancing in the direction it indicated. At first, he didn't see anything unusual. But then, out of the corner of his eye, he caught a flicker of movement, a shadow passing quickly across the glass. His stomach tightened. Grabbing the baseball bat, he moved cautiously toward the window and peered outside. The street below was empty, but something about the stillness made his skin crawl. Whoever, or whatever it was, they weren't far away. For the rest of the night, Daniel stayed awake, keeping watch. The cub remained close, occasionally chirping softly as if trying to reassure him. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and Daniel drifted off, slumped in his chair with the bat resting across his lap. When he woke the next morning, sunlight streamed through the curtains and the apartment was silent. The cub was curled up on the floor beside him, fast asleep. For a moment, Daniel allowed himself to relax, thinking maybe the danger had passed. But deep down, he knew better. Trouble always found him sooner or later. Despite the looming threat, Daniel couldn't help but marvel at how much the cub had changed his life. Before, his days had been monotonous, filled with meaningless tasks and empty hours. Now, every moment felt purposeful, whether it was feeding the cub, playing with it, or simply watching it explore its surroundings. It was a strange kind of companionship, one he hadn't expected but couldn't imagine giving up. Still, Daniel knew he couldn't protect the cub forever. Sooner or later, someone stronger or smarter than him would come knocking. And when that day arrived, he would have to make a choice. Risk everything to keep it safe or let it go and hope it found a better place to call home. For now, though, he pushed those thoughts aside. The cub was here and so was he. Whatever happened next, they would face it together. Daniel Hayes had never been the sentimental type. He didn't collect keepsakes or hang onto mementos from his past. His apartment was sparse, filled only with what he needed to survive: books for distraction, clothes for warmth, and food for sustenance. But now, as he watched the cub sprawled out on the floor chewing on an old sock, Daniel realized something had shifted. The cub wasn't just a responsibility anymore. It had become part of his life in ways he couldn't explain. The creature's presence brought a strange kind of rhythm to Daniel's days. Every morning before the sun rose, the cub would wake him with its chirps, demanding attention. At first, Daniel groaned and rolled over, pretending to sleep. But after a few mornings of persistent nudging, he gave up resisting. Instead, he started his day by feeding the cub scraps of meat and fresh water, watching as it eagerly devoured every bite. Its enthusiasm was infectious, and sometimes Daniel found himself smiling despite himself. After breakfast, the cub would follow him around like a shadow. If Daniel cleaned the apartment, the cub batted at the broom or tried to climb into the trash bag. If he read one of his books, it curled up at his feet, occasionally reaching out to paw at the pages. It seemed endlessly curious, exploring every corner of the apartment with wide-eyed wonder. One afternoon, while Daniel was fixing a loose cabinet hinge, the cub climbed onto the counter and knocked over a jar of screws. They scattered across the floor, and for a moment Daniel felt irritation rise. But then he saw the cub staring guiltily at him, its head tilted down and its ears flattened. Against his better judgment, Daniel laughed. "Your trouble," he said, shaking his head as he bent to pick up the screws. "Big trouble." The cub responded with a soft squeak as if agreeing. Then, without warning, it leapt off the counter and trotted away, disappearing behind the couch. Daniel sighed, setting the jar aside. "Where are you going now?" he called out, though he knew he wouldn't get an answer. The cub reappeared moments later, dragging one of Daniel's socks in its mouth. It dropped the sock at his feet and looked up expectantly, clearly proud of itself. Daniel stared at it for a long moment before picking up the sock and tossing it gently across the room. The cub pounced on it immediately, rolling onto its back and kicking its legs in the air as it chewed on the fabric. It was these small moments that made Daniel forget, even if only briefly, the danger lurking outside his door. Rachel Monroe hadn't returned since their last encounter, but Daniel knew she wasn't the type to give up easily. He could feel eyes on him whenever he left the apartment, hear faint footsteps echoing in the hallway late at night. Whoever, or whatever, was out there, they were waiting for the right moment to strike. One evening, as Daniel sat at the kitchen table flipping through an old newspaper, he noticed the cub acting strangely. It paced back and forth near the window, its fur bristling slightly. Occasionally, it stopped to peer outside, its large eyes scanning the darkness beyond the glass. Daniel frowned, setting the paper aside and walking over. "What's wrong?" he asked quietly, kneeling beside the cub. It turned to look at him, letting out a sharp chirp before pointing one tiny paw toward the window. Daniel's heart sank. Slowly, he stood and pulled the curtain aside, peering out into the street below. At first, everything seemed normal. The streetlights cast pools of yellow light onto the pavement, and the occasional car rumbled past. But then, in the shadows between two parked cars, Daniel caught a glimpse of movement, a figure slipping quickly out of sight. His jaw tightened as he let the curtain fall back into place. "Stay here," he muttered to the cub, grabbing the baseball bat he kept propped against the wall. He moved cautiously to the door, checking the peephole before unlocking it and stepping into the hallway. The building was silent, but the hair on the back of his neck stood on end. Something wasn't right. For the rest of the night, Daniel stayed alert, packing the apartment and keeping the bat within arm's reach. The cub stayed close, chirping softly whenever he passed by. Eventually, exhaustion took over and Daniel collapsed into his chair, slumping forward with the bat resting across his knees. When he woke the next morning, the apartment was quiet and the cub was curled up at his feet, fast asleep. Despite the lingering tension, Daniel couldn't deny how much the cub had changed his life. Before, his days had been empty, filled with meaningless routines and lonely hours. Now, every moment felt purposeful. Whether it was feeding the cub, playing with it, or simply watching it explore its surroundings, Daniel found himself looking forward to each new day. It was a strange kind of companionship, one he hadn't expected but couldn't imagine giving up. But deep down, Daniel knew he couldn't protect the cub forever. Sooner or later, someone stronger or smarter than him would come knocking. And when that day arrived, he would have to make a choice. Risk everything to keep it safe or let it go and hope it found a better place to call home. For now, though, he pushed those thoughts aside. The cub was here and so was he. Whatever happened next, they would face it together. The calm that had settled over Daniel's apartment didn't last long. For a few days, life continued as usual. The cub chirped in the mornings, chased socks across the floor, and curled up beside Daniel at night. But Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every time he stepped outside, he scanned the streets carefully, looking for familiar faces or suspicious movements. He avoided sticking to one route, taking different paths to the market or the park whenever possible. Still, the unease lingered like a shadow he couldn't escape. One evening, as Daniel returned from running errands, he noticed something unusual: a black car parked near his building. It wasn't the kind of vehicle you'd expect to see in this part of town, sleek and polished with tinted windows that reflected the dim streetlights. Daniel slowed his pace, his grip tightening on the grocery bag in his hand. He glanced around, searching for any sign of movement, but the street was eerily quiet. Even the usual hum of distant traffic seemed muted. When he reached his apartment door, he hesitated before unlocking it. Something felt off. The lock turned smoothly and the door creaked open without resistance, which should have been reassuring. But instead of relief, Daniel felt a knot form in his stomach. He stepped inside cautiously, his eyes scanning the room for anything out of place. At first glance, everything seemed normal. The couch was where it should be, the books stacked neatly on the shelves, the cub curled up in its usual spot by the window. But then Daniel noticed it. The metallic cage, usually sitting on the kitchen counter, was gone. His heart sank as he rushed toward the cub, kneeling down beside it. "Where's the cage?" he asked sharply, though he knew it wouldn't answer. The cub looked up at him, its large eyes wide and confused. It let out a soft chirp, tilting its head as if trying to understand what he was saying. Before Daniel could process what had happened, the sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway. Heavy boots thudded against the floorboards, and a voice called out, low and mocking, "Looking for something." Daniel froze, his mind racing. Slowly, he stood and turned to face the intruders. Two men stepped into the room, their faces obscured by hoods pulled low over their foreheads. Behind them stood Rachel Monroe, her arms crossed and a smug smile playing on her lips. "I warned you," she said, stepping forward. Her tone was casual, almost conversational, but her eyes gleamed with triumph. "You shouldn't have taken what isn't yours." Daniel clenched his fists, forcing himself to stay calm. "What do you want?" he demanded, his voice steady despite the anger bubbling beneath the surface. Rachel gestured to one of the men who held up the missing cage. Inside, a small pile of shredded paper lay scattered across the bottom, remnants of whatever they had used to line it. The cub whimpered softly, pressing itself closer to Daniel's leg. "Hand over the cub," Rachel said, her gaze fixed on him, "and maybe I'll let you walk away." Daniel shook his head, his jaw tightening. "Not happening." Rachel sighed dramatically, rolling her eyes. "I really hoped you'd cooperate." She nodded to the two men, who moved forward menacingly. One cracked his knuckles while the other pulled a knife from his belt. The fight that followed was brutal. Daniel fought with everything he had, using every trick he'd learned over the years. He ducked under the first man's swing, grabbing a chair and smashing it into the second man's chest. The cub squealed loudly, darting behind the couch as chaos erupted around it. Furniture toppled, glass shattered, and the air filled with grunts and curses. Rachel stayed back, watching the scene unfold with detached interest. When one of the men managed to land a blow to Daniel's ribs, sending him stumbling backward, she finally stepped in. She circled him slowly, her knife glinting in the dim light. "You're tough," she admitted, twirling the blade between her fingers. "I'll give you that, but you're outnumbered." Daniel spat blood onto the floor, glaring at her. "You think numbers scare me?" Rachel smirked, raising the knife. "They should." Just as she lunged, the cub leapt from its hiding spot, launching itself at her arm. Its sharp claws dug into her skin, causing her to drop the knife with a yelp of pain. Startled, the two men paused, giving Daniel the opening he needed. He tackled one of them to the ground, delivering a punch that knocked him unconscious. The other hesitated, clearly unsure whether to attack or retreat. Seizing the opportunity, Daniel grabbed the fallen knife and pointed it at Rachel. "Get out," he growled, his voice low and dangerous. "All of you." Rachel glared at him, clutching her bleeding arm. For a moment, it looked like she might argue. Then, with a venomous glare, she motioned to the remaining man. Together, they backed out of the apartment, dragging their unconscious companion with them. When they were gone, Daniel collapsed onto the floor, his body aching from the fight. The cub trotted over to him, nudging his hand gently. It let out a soft purr, its eyes filled with concern. "We're okay," Daniel muttered, patting its head weakly. "We're okay." But deep down, he knew the danger wasn't over. Rachel wouldn't give up so easily, and there were others out there who would stop at nothing to get their hands on the cub. Daniel realized he couldn't keep it safe forever, not in a cramped apartment in the middle of the city. If he wanted to protect it, he needed to find a better solution. That night, as the cub slept curled up beside him, Daniel made a decision. He would track down someone who could help, someone who specialized in protecting creatures like this. It wasn't going to be easy, but it was the only way to ensure the cub's safety. Whatever happened next, Daniel vowed to see it through. The cub had become more than just a companion, it had become family. And Daniel wasn't about to let anyone take that away from him. Daniel Hayes had spent most of his life running, from trouble, from responsibility, from anything that threatened to tie him down. But now, as he stood on the edge of a forest clearing at dawn, watching the sun rise over the horizon, he felt something different. For once, he wasn't running away. He was letting go, and it was harder than he ever imagined. The journey to this moment hadn't been easy. After the fight with Rachel and her men, Daniel knew he couldn't stay in the city any longer. Every shadow seemed darker, every sound louder. The cub, sensing his tension, stayed unusually close, its chirps softer and more hesitant than before. Daniel began making plans, reaching out to old contacts from his days working security for interstellar traders. It took time, but eventually, he found someone who could help. A woman named Owens, known for her work protecting endangered species. Lived far outside the city, deep in the countryside where the air smelled of pine trees and fresh earth instead of exhaust fumes and decay. Her property was surrounded by dense woods, with a large barn converted into a sanctuary for creatures too rare or unusual to survive in the wild. When Daniel arrived, she greeted him warmly, though her sharp eyes missed nothing. She listened carefully as he explained the situation, nodding thoughtfully when he mentioned the cub's shimmering fur and intelligent gaze. "This little one is special," said after examining the cub. "It belongs somewhere safe, somewhere it can grow without fear." Daniel nodded, though the words felt heavy in his chest. He had known this day would come, but knowing didn't make it easier. Over the past few weeks, the cub had become more than just a companion. It had become part of his daily life, part of who he was. Saying goodbye felt like losing a piece of himself. The transfer was scheduled for early morning, giving Daniel one last night with the cub. They spent it quietly, sitting together on the couch as they had so many times before. The cub curled up in his lap, its warm body rising and falling with each breath. Daniel ran his fingers through its soft fur, listening to the rhythmic purring that always seemed to calm him. "You're going to be okay," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "You'll have everything you need here." The cub looked up at him, its large eyes filled with trust. It let out a soft chirp as if trying to reassure him. Daniel smiled faintly, though his throat tightened with emotion. "I'm not good at this kind of thing," he admitted. "But I want you to know, you've made me better. You've reminded me what it means to care about something." When morning came, Daniel loaded the cub into its cage one final time. It didn't resist, simply staring at him with those unnervingly human eyes. As he carried it to his truck, he noticed how light it felt, as if it understood this was goodbye. Waited patiently beside the vehicle, offering a sympathetic smile. "He'll be safe here," she promised, placing a hand on Daniel's shoulder. "You've done the right thing." Daniel nodded, though his vision blurred slightly. He watched as placed the cage gently in the back of the truck, then climbed into the driver's seat. Before pulling away, she rolled down the window and gave him a small wave. The engine roared to life, and the truck began moving down the dirt road, disappearing into the trees. For a long time, Daniel stood there, staring at the empty space where the truck had been. The forest was quiet except for the rustling of leaves in the breeze. He felt hollow, as if a part of him had left with the cub. But beneath the sadness, there was also a strange sense of peace. He had done everything he could to protect it, to give it a chance at a better life. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. As he walked back toward his car, Daniel allowed himself to think about the future. For years, he had drifted aimlessly, avoiding connections and commitments. But now, he realized he didn't have to keep living that way. Caring for the cub had changed him, teaching him that it was possible to care about something, or someone, without losing himself in the process. Back in the city, Daniel returned to his apartment, which felt emptier than ever. The silence pressed against him, reminding him of all the mornings he'd woken up to the cub's chirps and playful antics. But instead of wallowing in regret, he started cleaning. He picked up the scattered papers, straightened the furniture, and wiped down the counters until the place sparkled. When he finished, he stepped back and surveyed the room, feeling a flicker of satisfaction. That night, Daniel sat on the couch with a cup of coffee, flipping through one of his books. For the first time in weeks, his mind felt clear. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew he wanted to live differently, not for himself, but because of the lessons the cub had taught him. Maybe he'd volunteer at an animal shelter or help with her work, or maybe he'd find another way to make a difference. Whatever he chose, he vowed to keep moving forward. Outside, the city buzzed with life, oblivious to the quiet transformation happening inside Daniel's apartment. Somewhere far away, the cub settled into its new home, surrounded by others like it, free from danger and fear. And though they were separated by miles, their bond remained, a reminder that even the smallest acts of kindness could leave a lasting impact. As Daniel leaned back on the couch, closing his eyes, he felt a faint smile tug at the corners of his mouth. For the first time in years, he felt hopeful. Whatever happened next, he was ready.